Captain Midnight.
Okay, so I have a confession to make. I was a talking animals movie kid. Big time. You put a talking animal into a movie and I was there. It didn't matter what the context was, I was showing up. Cats and Dogs, Homeward Bound, Racing Stripes, Good Boy, Stuart Little. 1998's Doctor Dolittle was maybe the most star-studded and successful version of that wave when it released. And I was all over it on VHS a few years later. So, with it just being added to Netflix, I decided to revisit it. Only to discover that, I didn't really remember this movie very well at all. So I kept going, watching every theatrically released Doctor Dolittle movie to make sense of this deeply strange, often troubled film series. And what I found was, well, I will get into it. But I think there's a lot more to talk about here than I originally anticipated. So whether you're a fan of Doctor Dolittle or baffled that I'm talking about these at all, I hope you'll stick around, because I think these movies, for better or often for worse, do an amazing job at distilling down the Hollywood trends of whatever era they were made in. And that makes for a fascinating discussion all these years later. So all these movies are, fairly loosely, based on Hugh Lofting's very British 1920 book series about a Victorian-era doctor who can talk to animals. It took decades of production stalling out and almost getting made for a movie to finally appear. The result was 1967's Doctor Dolittle, starring Rex Harrison and directed by Richard Fleischer, who seemed like a perfect fit, coming off big, effects-driven productions like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and the very enjoyable Fantastic Voyage. Now, this was a movie that I did not see as a kid, and when it came to watching it the first time, I think I only viewed it through the lens of its reputation. Doctor Dolittle, along with the 1963 epic Cleopatra, have kind of become the poster children for why the old studio system of Hollywood died and gave way to the new Hollywood of the 70s. Seen as bloated, old-fashioned, and not in touch with the changing audience of a very turbulent decade. That's how the story tends to be told. This time though, I really tried to go into Doctor Dolittle with an open mind. And while the movie isn't without merit, I do tend to like the sights and sounds of giant old studio productions like this. I definitely understand how it earned its reputation. Doctor Dolittle is boring. I know that's lazy and that's not very insightful, but that's how I felt sitting through this thing. And while some of the film is really nice to look at, the effects are incredibly uneven, even if, admittedly, they do have a lot of charm to them. I will say Rex Harrison gives a very solid performance at its center, and I could totally see how a child of the 60s would have fond memories of the film, but everything Doctor Dolittle does well, from its score to that decadent and fun old Hollywood epic scale, just aren't enough to overcome how plodding and dull a lot of it feels. I don't want to be too harsh on this one. It gave us some perfectly nice music, like Talk to the Animals, which has a great Louis Armstrong cover that would be reused in the 98 Dolittle, but I really can't picture myself ever coming back to it. It's just under 2.5 hours long, and it manages to feel like 3. At the time, there was a lot riding on Doctor Dolittle for the studio. And how did that end up? Well, you know things are bad when the movie star straight up says the film was a, quote, near fatal blow to 20th Century Fox's finances. And this feels to me like one of those movies with its bloated budget and hammy performances that critics at the time really had their knives out for. The New York Times ended their review with, "The music is not exceptional. The rendering of the songs lacks variety, and the pace, under Richard Fleischer's direction, is slow and without surprise. Indeed, toward the end it is perfunctory. Things happen mechanically. The actors appear self-conscious, and the fantasy is dull. The last shot of Mr. Harrison riding off on the giant lunar moth is embarrassing, I'd even think for children. Now will the real Dr. Dolittle please stand up?" Almost 60 years later, I can say I basically agree. It's worth noting though that the sheer scale of it did impress some at the time. It was nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and even won a few, like Best Sound and Best Visual Effects, which, I guess is more than I can say for any of the rest of these. That New York critic I quoted, Bosley Crowther, seemed to really want a Dolittle that hewed closer to the books. What we get 30 years later was basically the complete opposite of that. 1998's Doctor Dolittle bears very little resemblance to the book or the 67 movie. Now, there is some callbacks here, like Eddie Murphy giving a horse glasses, the movie ending on the Louis Armstrong cover, but for the most part, this was the Dolittle story recontextualized to fit the mold of a 90s family comedy. Anyone who grew up watching these movies will know exactly the tropes that I'm talking about. The overworked father who isn't being present enough in his kids' lives, something totally supernatural derailing important stuff happening at work, a lot of toilet humor balanced with tons of sentimentality. Like, you could slot Jim Carrey into this movie really easily. The only problem being the structure of it resembles something like Liar Liar so much. I'll start with the negative and then get to what I still enjoyed about this one. This screenplay, man, this was so generic and hacky. Just save the cat screenwriter 101 stuff through and through. Just not an original or interesting bone in its body. I think with lesser talent, the 98 Doctor Dolittle would be a really, really tough watch. Luckily for this movie though, the cast is absolutely stacked with great actors and comedians elevating this paper-thin material at every turn. I went into it mostly remembering Eddie Murphy and Chris Rock as the talking guinea pig, but I was surprised just how deep the bench was here. We have Norm Macdonald as Lucky, the sarcastic dog who becomes friends with Dolittle, Paul Giamatti as the jealous ex-med school classmate who runs a mental institution, Jeffrey Tambor as the clueless vet, Albert Brooks as the struggling tiger. They all get a lot of fun little moments, even if there's not much here as a whole. You know, for some reason I remember this being a super PG movie, and I was not prepared for the sheer amount of gross out and toilet humor going back to it.
Which was the style at the time? No!
It's crass, it's goofy, it's all very sappy, and it mostly hangs together thanks to the energy and talent of a cast that was very game, even for the dumbest jokes. To quote the late great Roger Ebert,
"The rectal thermometer sequence was hilarious. It was hilarious, Gene. Okay. This movie is fun."
Like, this is one of those comedies that feels saved by bringing in comedians to work on one-liners in the writer's room after the movie was shot. Eddie Murphy is incredibly talented, but I think he's kind of outshone by the animals here, as he's kind of stuck playing the straight man to all their wacky antics. Would I recommend Doctor Dolittle? I mean, if you have a soft spot or nostalgia for this vein of 90s movie, sure, but I think it's a good example of the excesses of 90s family comedies when they were at their peak, more than like a straight up good movie. Now, I definitely will not be recommending 2001's Doctor Dolittle 2, a movie about Eddie Murphy needing to get a bear voiced by Steve Zahn laid before evil developers destroy the forest. Oh god, this was bad. Again, you have tons of talent on display. Norm Macdonald's Lucky falls in love with a wolf. I don't know, that made me grin a few times. The female bear is voiced by Lisa Kudrow, doing her best with some really crappy writing, and Raven Simone's role is greatly expanded from the first movie, giving us the usual middle-aged dad is uneasy about his teen daughter dating for the first time plot. If you just like hanging out with some early 2000s celebs, I guess you could do worse, but you could do a lot better too. Call me grumpy if you want. I thought this was pretty brutal. Whatever charming elements were inherent in the Dolittle concept of the first movie are long gone, and we're left with a series of scenes that feel padded out to hit the minimum necessary running time and to get it out the door. Going back to Ebert though, like, he liked this one even more than the first, so clearly it has its defenders. I just found almost nothing to laugh at here. The escalation present in the first movie as Dolittle tries his best to ignore all the talking animals around him as it kind of ruins his life is completely gone now, and as a result, the movie feels totally flat. After the second movie did solid, but not nearly as well as the first, Dr. Dolittle ventured into what I would call the Air Bud/Air Buddies territory, with a series of direct-to-video titles squarely aimed at little kids. I'm going to cover these less since they weren't theatrically released, but I'll go over them briefly. Most of the cast is gone in Doctor Dolittle 3, with the only big names returning being Kyla Pratt, who played the youngest daughter in the first two, and Norm Macdonald. I love Norm, but when it comes to movies, he could really never turn down a paycheck. 6 years later, he was playing a vampire dog in, Vampire Dog. Anyway, I guess if I can find one positive thing to say about Dolittle 3, it's that it actually moves the story of Dolittle's youngest daughter forward in a way that makes sense. At the end of the first one, she has to come home from summer camp early because she doesn't fit in. In 3, she goes to another camp, this time determined to seem normal, only for her dad's hereditary magic power to complicate things. The tone of 3 is far more kid-friendly, and honestly is kind of what I remembered the first one being before I rewatched it, but it is obviously much cheaper. Critics were not impressed, not that these movies were really for them, especially at this point. Like, you throw this on at a daycare, and it probably plays just fine. 2 more titles would follow, and outside of a voice in the last one being done by Stephen Root, who I really love in Barry and News Radio, I don't think there's much to say about these. Fox was grinding out cheap DVD sequels for families just looking to distract the kids for 90 minutes, and I guess they didn't embarrass themselves as far as these things go. Eventually, the DVD market collapsed. Kyla Pratt was leaning into Lifetime Christmas movies and voice work, and the series quietly ended with 2009's $1 Million Mutts. But that wasn't the end for Dr. Dolittle. Not by a long shot. 11 years later, studios went from cashing in with cheapy sequels to trying to make a big, expensive franchise play with arguably Hollywood's biggest star. January 2020 brought us Dolittle, Robert Downey Jr.'s attempt to bring the series full circle and give us something that more closely resembles the source material. You know, I'd like to say, just for the arc of this video, that this is like where these movies got redeemed, where the simple pleasure of Lofting's books were finally translated to the screen in a way that made why they charmed kids for generations so apparent. But this was not that movie. Dolittle got lost in the craziness that was 2020, mostly ignored and forgotten. But I think RDJ almost got off easy here, because this is a truly, truly terrible movie. Watching it made me appreciate all the previous films, even Doctor Dolittle 2, a little bit more. Mostly for, and this may seem strange at first, all the nice animals that those movies had to look at. Say what you will about how slow the 60s movie is, or how poorly aged the talking effects are in the Murphy films, at least there's a lot of, like, actual creatures to look at. Here, they're all very obviously computer generated, losing any hint of charm that Robert Downey Jr. walking around with a duck and a polar bear in a hat might have had. Unlike the Murphy series, they do set this back in the Victorian era, and they obviously have a lot of money to work with. But how they chose to go about this ended up being deeply strange. The animal sidekicks are mostly terrible, but the real problem here is RDJ himself, turning in a career worst performance. Like, on paper, it's probably really easy to picture what this performance would be in your head. Downey Jr. had already played another icon of British literature in Sherlock Holmes. You take that, you really dial up the whimsy, and there you go, Dr. Dolittle, right? Well, I guess to his credit, RDJ really wanted to make sure that there was no crossover in these performances, including in the accent. In an appearance on Joe Rogan, he talked pretty passionately about being inspired by an 1800s Welsh doctor named William Price. You want to check out an interesting Wikipedia page? Look up that, guys. He had a lot going on. I'm not going to pretend to be any sort of expert here, but from what I understand, Price spent a lot of his life trying to revive the ancient druid religion of the Celts, which emphasized man's relationship to nature. Now, does that interesting performance backstory come through in the movie? Absolutely not. Other than Dolittle mumbling like 70% of his lines through an accent that I'm just not convinced works for this character. He's just mumbling so fast that it's really hard to understand him in places. Much like how the 90s movie hits all the beats that were expected in family comedies back then, Dolittle does the same for would-be blockbusters of the late 2010s and 2020s. You've really got it all. Dolittle begins the movie as a shell of himself, a sad old man broken up by the death of his late wife, who was created for the film, and then has to get his groove back. The movie is pretty crude like the 90s film in places, but also has some very on-the-nose like lessons, with the doctor basically delivering some therapy speak to help out the animals. There's ugly CGI action set pieces, by-the-numbers YA book storytelling for the two kids' sidekicks, and you basically get the gist. I will say though, both the kids are pretty solid at least. They do seem more invested in making this movie work than any of the voice actors. Maybe aside from those two, everything around RDJ just kinda sucks as well. From the gross out humor that now feels very out of place tonally, to those voice performances that feel way more phoned in than the 90s movie. I really think the only thing that could have saved Dolittle was an absolutely magnetic performance from its lead. And RDJ is just not providing that. And I think the studio knew that too. They dumped this movie in January for a reason. The development was a total mess behind the scenes, with people being moved in and out. Chris McKay, the director of the Lego Batman movie, was brought in to try to salvage it with rewrites. It's very clear though that nothing here came together, with RDJ saying it caused him to reassess his entire career. So that's it, the history of the Doctor Dolittle movies. I gotta say, this was a rocky ride, not one of my favorite series that I've sat through for one of these franchise videos, but I do think that each of these movies are interesting in their own right. Even aside from quality, they do a great job of showing the excesses of studio filmmaking in whatever era they were made in. Now, there is some fun to be had here, don't get me wrong. If you love those 90s movies as much as Ebert seemed to, more power to you. But for me, Dr. Dolittle is mostly interesting as a series of attempts to take a very old children's story and transform it into the mold of whatever was hot at the time. It may not make for great movies, but at least they are pretty fascinating as time capsules. If you watch my channel often, there's a pretty good chance you're a fan of The Office and cringe comedy in general. And if that's the case, man, you have to check out the upcoming The Dinner Plan from fellow creator Patrick H. Willems. So I just watched it this week, and he really pulled off a funny, tense, and stressful as hell comedy of manners that I can't recommend enough. It stars Griffin Newman, who you may know from The Tick on Amazon or the movie podcast Blank Check, and has a cast filled out by the likes of Severance's Zach Cherry and comedian John Hodgman, and all of them are so well cast. You can check it out on November 26th on Nebula. Nebula is built to be the go-to spot for creators and viewers who want something different. All my videos are there ad-free, plus exclusives that you won't find here, like my takes on Madden and Fire Emblem. You can join now for 40% off. That's a year for $36 or $3 a month. Lifetime memberships are only $300 with my discount at go.nebula.tv/Captain Midnight. You'll also get guest passes to share a week of access with friends. Just scan the QR code on screen or use the link in the description or pinned comment below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.